The bell above McRae's general store rang thin and tired, the way everything in Willow Bend sounded after a long drought. Dust lay on the street like a second skin, and the sun pressed down as if it meant to flatten the town into the prairie. Inside the store, a woman stood at the counter with a small pile of pennies spread in her palm, counting and recounting them with lips barely moving. Her name was Clara Whitfield. Folks knew that much, and not much else. She kept to herself since her husband died 3 winters ago, taken by a fever that came through like a thief in the night and left her with a thin house, a small garden, and a boy who tried to be brave at 10 years old. Clara's dress had been mended so often the original cloth was a memory, and her boots were polished only where the leather still held together. She slid the pennies into neat rows, then swept them back together, uncertainty creeping into her eyes. "I just need a loaf," she said softly to Mr. McRae, whose mustache twitched as he watched the coins. "The small one, if you have it." McRae glanced at the bread shelf, then at the pennies. He wasn't a cruel man, but he ran a business in a town that barely kept itself alive. "That'll be 8 cents, he said. Prices went up again. Flour's hard to get." Clara nodded, already knowing the answer before she asked. She counted again, 7 pennies. Her shoulders drew in, like she was trying to take up less space. "I see," she said, and began to gather the coins back into her purse. From the shadow near the doorway, a man watched without moving. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded blue shirt and a hat that had seen more miles than most folks in Willow Bend ever would. His boots were scuffed but cared for, his gun worn smooth from use. Folks called him Luke Calder, though many knew him only as that cowboy who rides in from the south. Luke had come into town for supplies and a letter he hoped might be waiting at the post office, one more unanswered hope among many. He'd meant to be in and out quick. But the sight of Clara counting pennies snagged him like a barbed wire fence. He remembered his own mother doing the same thing once, long ago, when his father didn't come home from a cattle drive. He remembered the way pride and hunger fought in her eyes, and how a single kind act had carried them through a winter. The memory tightened his chest. Without a word, Luke stepped forward. He set a silver coin on the counter, the sound sharp in the quiet store. "Bread, flour, beans," he said, voice calm. "Sugar if you've got it. And coffee." McRae looked from the coin to Luke, then to Clara, understanding dawning. "That's more than." "Keep it," Luke said. "Fill her cupboards." Clara turned, startled. "Sir, you don't." Luke met her eyes, steady and kind, and shook his head once. "It's already done." Something in his tone closed the door on argument. McRae moved quickly then, gathering sacks and tins, wrapping bread in paper. Clara stood frozen, hands clenched in her skirt, tears threatening but not yet falling. Luke tipped his hat, stepped back, and was gone before she found the words to thank him. That might have been the end of it. A single good deed swallowed by the wide mouth of the West, but Willow Bend was a small place, and kindness had a way of echoing. Clara carried the parcels home in a daze, setting them on her kitchen table as if they might vanish. Her son, Eli, came in from chopping kindling and stared wide-eyed at the bounty. "Ma," he asked. "Did we?" "No," she said, smiling through tears now. "Someone was kind." They ate bread with butter that night, real butter, and Clara slept easier than she had in months. Still, the next morning she woke with a knot of determination in her chest. She didn't know Luke Calder's name, but she knew his face, and she knew she couldn't let the debt sit heavy on her heart. Luke, for his part, didn't think much of it as he rode out of town. He had a line shack to fix and a herd to check, and the prairie didn't care about good intentions. But the image of Clara stayed with him, the way she tried to shrink, the quiet strength in her spine. Days passed. The drought lingered. Then trouble came riding in with the Hardin brothers. They were mean men with quick tempers and quicker fists, and they'd set their sights on Clara's small plot of land. It sat close to the creek, one of the few places where water still whispered under cracked banks. When they rode up, dust boiling around their horses, Clara felt the same helpless fear she'd felt at the store, but she stood her ground. "You're behind on taxes," the eldest Hardin said, grin sharp. "County's looking to sell." "I'll pay," Clara said. "I just need time." "Time's money," he replied, and leaned closer. "And you ain't got either." Eli stood in the doorway, jaw set, hands shaking. Clara put a hand behind her, steadying him. They might have pushed further, might have taken more than words, if Luke Calder hadn't ridden up then, quiet as a shadow. He took in the scene with a glance, eyes going hard. "Problem?" he asked. The Hardins sneered. "This ain't your concern, cowboy." Luke smiled thinly. "Looks like it is." There was something in his stance, in the way he rested his hand near his holster without touching it, that made even the Hardins reconsider. Words were exchanged, sharp, dangerous ones. But in the end the brothers backed off, promising they'd be back. Luke watched them go, then turned to Clara. "You all right?" She nodded, swallowing. "Thank you." Again. He shrugged. "Didn't do much." "You did," she said, meeting his eyes. "You don't know how much." That was how Luke Calder became a part of Clara Whitfield's life, not with grand declarations, but with small, steady acts. He fixed a fence one afternoon. Brought a sack of feed another. Taught Eli how to ride proper, how to sit a horse and read the land. Clara tried to pay him back with meals, with mended shirts, with quiet company on the porch as the sun went down red over the prairie. Luke accepted without fuss, finding in her kitchen a piece he hadn't known he was missing. They didn't speak of the past much. Luke had his ghosts, men he'd lost, mistakes that rode with him like an extra shadow. Clara had hers. But they understood each other in the way of people who'd been broken and learned how to stand again. The Hardins did come back, as promised. This time they brought papers and a deputy who looked the other way. Luke was there, too, and so were a handful of townsfolk who'd seen enough. McCrae stood shoulder to shoulder with the blacksmith. Even the preacher showed up, Bible tucked under his arm like a shield. It didn't end in blood. It ended in words and witnesses and a sudden interest from the county in why certain taxes were being pressed harder on some than others. The Hardins rode away that day, beaten not by guns but by a community that had found its spine. After that, Willow Bend began to breathe again. The drought broke. The creek rose. Clara's garden flourished, and Eli laughed more than he had in years. One evening, as cicadas sang and the sky went purple, Luke sat on Clara's porch, hat in his hands. "I ain't much for staying in one place," he said, voice careful. "But I've been thinking, maybe I could try." Clara looked at him, really looked, at the man who had filled her cupboards without a word and her life with quiet strength. "I ain't much for asking," she replied. "But I'd like that." They didn't marry quick. The West had taught them patience. But when they did, it was simple and sure, witnessed by a town that had learned the power of small kindnesses. Years later, when folks told the story, they'd start with a woman counting pennies for a loaf of bread. They'd talk about a cowboy who filled her cupboards without a word. And if you listened close, you'd hear what really mattered, not the coin, or the bread, or even the land, but the way one act of quiet mercy had changed everything. Because in a place as hard as the Old West, kindness wasn't just a virtue. It was survival.